I'm the media coordinator here at the museum, and it's my job to get the word out about these events. And so, like I said, I'm very excited that there are so many people here today. Oh, great. Thank you guys for telling me where you heard about it. I just wanted to let you know, I'll be here the whole time in case there's any sort of technical difficulties. You can reach me in the chat. And then Bill's first slide of the presentation will have my cell phone number on it. So you can text me or call me if you're having trouble, and I will help, try and help you out as best I can. So I think we better get started. And so let me introduce Bill. I think a lot of you know him, but Bill is our past president and our current treasurer of the Elgin Historical Society. He's the in-house expert on the Elgin National Watch Company collection, the historian at the Elgin Mental Health Center, and the co-author of Elgin Time with Mike Alft, which you may or may not know, we just reprinted last month. Hold it up, Bill. Show him.
There we go. With new layout, a new book, more pictures, a name index, and a little bit more material than we had when the 2003 version came out. We only ran 400 copies of this because we want everybody to be able to trade these up in value over the next several decades. So there, we'll give you a little where you can buy it information in a few minutes in our shameless commerce division. So are we ready to go, Trish?
Yep, I think so. I'll just continue to let people in as they come in, but just go ahead and get started.
Okay, so what we want to do is ask Liz to switch the screen over to the slideshow.
Do you want to do that right now? Or you want to talk for a minute?
No, I don't want to talk for a minute, but I will when we get the thing going. I got it right down there, except for that's not the right part of the screen. Here.
Right.
Good. Go to first slide, please. Thank you very much. All right, now we're almost set to go. First of all, I want to say, as I just mentioned, that this, whoops, let me go to the beginning. So Liz, before you run out, I want to start that from the beginning. But what I want to say from the start is that in around the year 2000, I had the great privilege and great honor to be asked by Mr. Mike Alft to assist him in writing a history of the watch company. Now, of course, Mr. Alft is Elgin's premier historian and still with us, although he lives in Pennsylvania. And he had assembled tons of notes on the watch company. And he had a very good knowledge of the company's history. I had a general knowledge of the company's history, but I understood the watch industry better from my work at the Elgin History Museum doing research on watches. And so we combined our knowledge to create Elgin Time. And we did pretty good little sales on that book for a few years, and then it's been out of print for a long time. So we thought we would update it. And we did do that because in part, we are indebted to the contributions that came in from two families. One was from Jerry Young and his family, and that's Young spelled J-U-N-G. And he was the comptroller at the Elgin National Industries. And when the watch company merged into what became Elgin National Industries, Jerry ended up with a garage full of financial records from the watch company. And it didn't tell the whole story of what happened, but it did allow us to put a few more pieces to the puzzle. And second thing that we picked up a little more information on since the 2003 book was on the pension fight. And the family of Walter Volman came in a few years back, and they had a nice little treasure trove of articles and documents related to the pension fight. So in redoing Elgin Time for the current publication, we were able to incorporate the information from these generous families who donated this material, which of course will be preserved for other historians and interested parties from here on out. So are we ready to roll yet here, Liz?
Yes.
Okay. So the title of this is Why Did the Watch Company Go Out of Business? There's been a lot of lectures over the years by myself and even more by my good friend Jerry Turnquist on the history of the company. But there's always this lingering question as to why did the watch company go out of business? And that's a long story. We'll get into in a few minutes. And so this lecture and slideshow concentrates on what it was that really the factors that it was that took the big company down. But as I said earlier, let's get that next slide up here. Liz, here we go. Hit the right button. As I said earlier, if you're having technical problems, this is a number you could call and talk to Trish. And it'd actually be better if you didn't call, but you texted. And this number, it's 617-592-9009. That'll go right to her cell phone, or you could use the chat feature. And we'll try to fix any technical problems on our end. But if you're having problems at home, well, I'm afraid we can't do much to help you with that. So let me get. Okay, so as I said, this book on Elgin Time is available at the museum store or on the museum's website at elginhistory.org. The retail price is $25 plus sales tax. And if you're lucky enough to be a museum member, you could get a 15% discount. That's about $3.75 off. So as I said, this is a new layout for the book, so we have more pictures. I think they're a little bit better quality reproduction of the pictures, and a few other features built into it, like a name index and, I don't know, I think just a more readable format. So now, why did the watch company go out of business? Well, a lot of people ask me that question, and rather than tell them, hey, you got an hour to spare, I always kind of look for a few little short answers. And of course, people have their own little ideas about that. So here are some of the common opinions about why the watch company went out of business. And let me just comment on it briefly. Foreign competition, yes, certainly that was a big, big factor. Timex, yeah, yes and no. And I'll explain why. Timex and Elgin were not competing head to head in the same market. Timex was selling a lower quality and cheaper priced watch, and Elgin was selling a higher quality and better quality watch. So they weren't exactly competing on the same price points, but Timex did have an impact on it. But Timex was preceded by other companies that also had a big impact on the watch company's sales. Lack of tariff protection, well, yes, the watch company certainly needed tariff protection after the 1920s, and they asked for it over and over again, and they got it to some degree, but it eroded away, primarily because tariffs are a double-edged sword. You put a tariff on some other country, and they're going to put a tariff on you. And the United States was particularly interested in selling goods to Switzerland because they have limited manufacturing base. And Switzerland was particularly interested in selling what was the main export, watches, to the United States. So the tariff protection gradually slipped away in the favor of allowing other American industries to penetrate the Swiss market. High wage employees. Well, if you talk to the people that work down at the big shop on National Street, I would say that most of them wouldn't consider themselves high-waged employees. However, relative to the labor costs of Swiss watches, Elgin and the American companies was relatively high. In the 1950s, 60s, about 1/3 of the cost of a Swiss watch was in wages, but the American watches were about 80%. And so it was high wages relative. And another factor that affects the cost of labor in any item is the efficiency of the manufacturing plants. And so the Swiss plants in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were more efficient in terms of labor costs per watch than the American companies were. So high wages had something to do with it. That's related to a failure to modernize. Yes, by the 1950s, Elgin was having trouble modernizing, although they certainly came out with some very important innovations. Another thing that people often point to is turmoil in the boardroom. And if you worked at the company or lived through that time period, turmoil in the boardroom was very much a factor, at least from the employee's perspective. Greed, well, that's a little tough to put your finger on. After all, people are in business to make money, and companies need to make money to stay in business. Of course, the watch company had a very paternalistic run during the 1900 up to the 1950s with its employees. It was very generous in sharing some of that prosperity with the employees. That wasn't quite true towards the end when different managers were running the company from the corporate office. Whether it was greed or not, you'll have to decide. Greed certainly seems to have played a role in the pension fight, which we'll get into as a little postscript to this discussion. And the last thing that people ask about is, the quartz movements kill the watch company? Well, the answer to that is no. Quartz movements, battery operated quartz movements, came onto the watch market scene generally worldwide, maybe in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was after Elgin had folded. Although the quartz watch was prototyped while Elgin was still in business, but getting it into production took a few more years, and by that time, Elgin was gone. Now, let's see, next slide. For a little background now, we need to step back to when Elgin was at its peak in 1927, because the reason the company failed is related to a lot of things in history. It's multiple causation, and it's the convergence of several trends. So to give you a little background, let's go back to when Elgin was at its peak in the year about 1927. And here's a great shot of that fabulous factory building. These two facades have been rebuilt and they looked fabulous. The older factory was still behind there, and that part of the factory complex, some of it dated back to the 1860s, mostly the 1870s and 80s, but it was buried down inside there. But this massive and beautiful and impressive building was there in 1927. And in 27, the company was financially sound. It was profitable. It was debt-free and had been for almost 30 years. And it had dominance in the American marketplace. It was a pretty modern plant. It had a great and loyal workforce, and it had a wonderful top-notch engineering department going for it. But that's not all. It was a leader after about 1900, mostly after about 1910, in terms of employee benefits, with paid sick time, holiday time, vacation time, a mortuary fund, which is a little life insurance fund, and a pension fund. Plus, the company also had an employee stock options, not options, but employee stock, profit sharing through employee stock. It had a nurse on site, so it had a little infirmary there where you could get some health care right at the plant. Of course, it had the observatory, which increased its prowess in terms of making watches, and it had the watch college. It had, as my friend Jerry Turnquist said, nobody else had anything like it. It was a complete watchmaking complex, and it was. But it's a changing world for watchmaking, and if you had your fingers in the wind in 1927, you could start to pick up these currents that were going to affect the company over the next couple of decades and ultimately lead to its demise. So in 27, let me show you this little graphic. This graphic, which goes up to a little past 1927, shows the conventional jeweled watch companies, the number of companies in business. Elgin was the second company to be profitable, coming on the scene in the late 1860s. And several other companies jumped into the business, making jeweled watches, more than's even on this graphic. But a lot of them came and went rather quickly during the 19th century. And then they began to drop off. The number of companies began to drop off after 1900 as competition killed off the weaker manufacturers. But there was another segment of the watch market, and that was the companies that were making very inexpensive jeweled watches and what were known as dollar watches. Now, let me take a minute here for those that aren't familiar with this and explain very briefly what a jeweled watch is. The jewels and watches weren't used for decorations. They were used inside the movement as bearings. They were shaped like little cups and little donuts, and the moving parts of the watch would be mounted in these jewels, which served as bearings to reduce the friction between what would have otherwise been metal on metal parts. So a jeweled watch would last longer and it would run more accurately, and it was a better level of craftsmanship. After about 1890, dollar watches appeared. Dollar watches were cheaply made watches that were stamped out, and the movements were put together very quickly, and they were sold very inexpensively. Dollar watches got their name because they cost $1 at a time when the movements for Elgin were costing like $5, $6, $7, $8 up a piece, and that was without the case. Dollar watches were typically sold with the case because the whole thing was kind of put together real quick in the factory. And then there was a slightly smaller little segment of the market for the inexpensive jeweled watches. And these were jeweled watches, but they were made with very cheaply made movements, and they only used a few jewels in the parts with the most wear. So they weren't jeweled enough to like compete with the conventional jeweled watches. So what you can see is how many companies were in the business in the late 20s. And we'll go to the next slide. You can see what the cumulative sales were of these watches, these types of watches over the many years. And what you'll note here of importance is that, I'm sorry, not the cumulative sales, we'll see that in a minute, but rather the yearly production rate. And what we see here is that the yearly production rate of dollar watches had surpassed jeweled watches in around 1900, and the sales rate was growing fast, whereas the jeweled watch sales were dropping off. And this is probably only showing domestic production. Part of the drop after, say, around 1915 in the jeweled watch industry was because of foreign watches coming in. But the American manufacturers, which were being thinned out through competition, were also facing competition from the Swiss. Now, let's take a look at how big a production we're talking about here. This is total production up to 1930, and you can see at that point, Elgin had already surpassed Waltham, the #2 manufacturer, in terms of total production. Now, Elgin went on to produce more than 50 million watches. And in the big picture of the American jeweled industry, Elgin produced about half the watches, Waltham about 35%, and all the other companies combined about 15%. You can see that the total production up to 1930 was about 79 million. Here's a little tally of the inexpensive jeweled watches, that little segment that I referred to a minute ago. And their total production was about 1/10 of that, about 7.2 million. But take a look at the dollar watch production. And remember, dollar watches got started a couple of decades after the jewel watch industry in America. By 1930, they were already up to 186 million watches made, more than twice what the jeweled watch industry was. So there's a lot of growth in the marketplace for jeweled watches. And I want to draw your attention to the jeweled watch industry, to the Waterbury Watch Company, because Waterbury evolved into a company called US Time, and US Time made Timex. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Meanwhile, there's the Swiss. And wow, what a great country Switzerland is. Fantastic scenery, well-developed infrastructure, beautiful cities, clean, healthy places to be, with wonderful, bright, personable people, and just a great place to be. Now, some of you might say, hey, wait a minute, that's the Matterhorn in the background. And the watch industry in Switzerland was really on the western end of Switzerland in the Jura mountain regions. Yes, that's true. They weren't making watches around where the Matterhorn was, which was by Zermatt and closer to Italy. They were making them on the west side. But what the heck? This is television, so we have to do a little something to make the images look great. Anyway, the Swiss were not to be underrated. They were they were beautiful, wonderful people, but they were tremendous competitors, and that competition was very well illustrated in the watch industry. Watchmaking in Switzerland was part and parcel with the national identity, and although the American watch industry in the late 19th and early 20th century had kind of knocked the Swiss out of the American market, the Swiss studied American manufacturing techniques, adopted it, and roared back starting in the starting all never stopping really, but really starting to accelerate their sales in America in the 19 teens and the 20s, certainly the 30s even more so, the 40s for sure, and into the 1950s. Holy cow, the Swiss dominated the jeweled watch movement, and they were also sending in some of the cheaper watches to compete. Now, this goofy looking cow is decked out for the annual movement of cattle, dairy cattle, to the summer pastures up in the upper parts of the mountain passes and places like that where their snow had gone away. So that's part of the Swiss culture and part of the tourist attraction of Switzerland. Well, let's take a look at the number of jeweled watches being sold in America. And you can see from this little graphic in 1923 and 1928, a span of just 5 years, how powerful the foreign made watches, which were mostly Swiss, some English and some French, how powerful that growth was in just that 5 year span, more than doubling. Whereas American made watch sales, not exactly doubling and kind of dribbling away a little bit there. This is 1928. And remember, we're looking at Elgin National Watch Company right at this period in time, 1927, 1928. And who were some of these Swiss brands? Well, these are names that are probably familiar to a number of people. Grun, Bulova, Benrus, Omega, Longines, Wittnauer, several others. But Grun and Bulova were probably the main competitors in the United States. And both of these Swiss companies had set up, assembly plants in the United States. And so a lot of people were confused really about whether these were Swiss companies or American companies. And these assembly plants were used to import partially finished watches because they could get around some of the tariff restrictions that way, and then finish the final assembly in the United States and move them into the American market. This happened during the 20s and 30s especially, and then a little bit beyond that. But if you had your finger into the wind, who could have possibly anticipated these other catastrophes that were going to happen? Of course, the stock market crash in 29, followed by the Great Depression, and the never-ending Great Depression, and followed by the war, World War II. You wouldn't have been able to anticipate that, but these are all factors that had pretty heavy impact on the watch industry, particularly the American watch industry. I mean, after all, watches are sort of a luxury item, and when you're out of work, you're not spending your money on watches. So sales of American watches really took a hit after 1929, and it took a number of years before that began to recover into the late 30s. So the war provided a little boost for Elgin, and you could see even before Pearl Harbor in December of 41, the military was beginning to ramp up with more supplies and a draft and so on. And you can see that after Pearl Harbor in December of 41, the company, Elgin Watch Company, went entirely to military production. The American industry in general went to military production, but the watch company and all the American watch companies went into it big time. I want to draw your attention to this picture on the left. to some of these military products, and you'll note the red circle around these little cone-shaped objects. Here's a close-up of one. And these are the timing devices that were used in anti-aircraft shells. Inside of that device, which was screwed onto the top of the shell, was a little timer. And that timer was set so that when that thing was blasted off at an incoming aircraft, after just a few split seconds of travel up to that altitude that those planes were at, it would detonate a charge, and that shell would explode and send shrapnel all out into the air. That's where you see those pictures of planes flying through with these black clouds bursting. Well, that's the burst of shrapnel on those shells, with the hope that that shrapnel will cut into those airplanes and damage it enough to knock them out of the sky. So these timing devices play an important part in our story, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. But as I said, the war was a boost for Elgin and helped it pull it out of the depression. But it was a double-edged sword for the company. One of the things that they did, I'll tell you the two edges of it, but one of the things they did, one of the good edges, is that they were able to expand and acquire other assets and resources. And one of which was a plant number 2 on Bluff City Boulevard. The defunct Elgin Clock Company had started here, and the building was sitting vacant for a few years during the 30s. This building is still there, of course. You could go down and see it. It doesn't have that fence around it anymore, nor does it have that little guard outpost shack on the corner there. After all, we wouldn't want any saboteurs to sneak into Elgin and attack the watchmaking facilities. But this plant was in charge of making fuses for those shells that we were just looking at. The watch company also leased another plant in Aurora, which was called Plant 3. Now, this plant was set up to make jewels. The watch company alertly realized that things were getting bad in Europe, and they might run, and that's where they are getting their jewels from, and that they might have a problem with that going forth. So in the 30s, they went over to Europe and bought jewel making equipment and brought that to the United States and got a little operation going at the main plant, and then later moved it down here to Aurora. This plant was leased, and it did produce the jewels for several years. You'll note that also has a little guard tower out in front of it. Now, in the post-war years, this continues our discussion of the background environment that the watch company was in. In the post-war years, the watch company had a few challenges to deal with as they re-entered the civilian watch market. First, of course, they had to retool the plant for civilian timepieces. And it wasn't until 1948 that civilian output had reached the pre-war levels. They were able to get civilian watches into production before 48. In fact, starting right after VJ Day, they were able to start doing that because they had inventory and stock that they could use. And some of the military timepieces were pretty close to some of the civilian timepieces with just a change of the dial and the straps and that. But it did take a while to retool and get up to speed to 1948. And during that time, they were faced with the continuing growth of Swiss watch sales in the United States. Now, during the war, Switzerland was able to import watches to the United States. The United States watch companies were not making watches at all. And so the Swiss were able to fill whatever demand there was for new watches during the war years. And their growth was interesting and phenomenal. The watch company coming out of the war had a labor shortage in Elgin. That's what drove them to acquire a plant in Lincoln, Nebraska for other production. This would be the first time that Elgin watches weren't being made in Elgin, Illinois. So here's a picture of the Lincoln plant, and it was later expanded upon. Now, here's the lay of the land in terms of American-made watches versus imported watches. The American-made being the little blue lines at the bottom, and the imported watches, which again were mostly Swiss watches, you can see were dwarfing the production of the American-made watches. So by 1948, the company had a new president, James Shannon. Now, Mr. Shannon wasn't new to the company. He was a Princeton graduate, and he came to work at the watch company right out of college. And he was being groomed for an executive position. And so they brought him into the company. They sent him to the watch college. He learned, he had a 2 or 3 year course in watchmaking. He went over the plant. He was involved in various managerial jobs. He eventually had a position as a foreman in a couple of times in a couple of positions. And then he worked his way up the ladder to be in charge of fuse production during World War II. After World War II, he was part of a delegation of American businessmen that went to Europe to study European industry, what was left of it, what was needed in the post-war environment. So he had a pretty good look at not only how things were done in Elgin from the shop floor up, but also how things were being done in Switzerland, Germany, and England, which were the big watchmakers at that time. So Shannon was named president after serving a few years as vice president. He's named president in 1948. This picture, by the way, he was 38, just about 38 years old at the time. This picture was taken about 10 years later than that. But Shannon realized that if the company was going to survive, it needed to do something to deal with the pressures that it was under. So Shannon and the executive team, and probably no doubt the board of directors, came up with a two-pronged strategy to help Elgin National Watch Company survive. Those two prongs were first diversification, and second vertical integration. Now, what do those two words mean? Well, vertical integration is when a company tries to control the entire process of manufacturing from the raw materials to the sales outlet. So you try to bring under one roof, or at least under one control, all of the parts and pieces you need to bring a product all the way to market. And the hopes, of course, is that you will be more efficient and you will be able to squeeze the profit out of all the middlemen and suppliers so that you can make a better buck on it. So Elgin was interested in going into the case business in the 1950s. Elgin had never been making cases before, although a little bit, I should say, when they were in a lawsuit with the Illinois Watch Case Company. But essentially, they weren't making cases. And so rather than start from scratch, they found out that the Wadsworth Watch Case Company was for sale. And by the way, this is Wadsworth, Kentucky, not Wadsworth, Illinois. They found out that the Wadsworth plant was for sale, and they investigated that, and they bought Wadsworth in 1950 so they could at least control the manufacturing of movements in cases. And then they also bought the Hadley Company, which was in Rhode Island. Hadley made the bands. And they also made other things like cufflinks and tie clips and little jewelry items like that. So part of the vertical integration strategy was to get Wadsworth and Hadley on board. Now, diversification meant moving into other industries that broadened them from just the company from just being in the watchmaking business. So what they did in diversification is, first of all, they looked at what they had great skills and knowledge of already going. What products did they have that were incidental to the watchmaking business that they could then spin off into other companies that could serve other industries? And one of these was abrasives, of course, that there's a lot of grinding and use of abrasives and finishing metal for the watches, and precision lubricants. The watches use a very tiny amount of oil, but it's a very, very special oil. And Elgin had perfected a very good quality oil, which was pictured in the lower right there. And metal, Elgin had been working for a number of years on an alloy, which became known as alloy. And after they developed this for their mainsprings, they also sought other commercial possibilities for this alloy. But the one thing Elgin was very good at as a company was making very small things. And so they began to branch into industries that were making very small things. And relay switches were getting smaller and smaller. They bought into American Microphone Company, which was also making phonograph cartridges. And this is, right at the end of World War II and in the dawn of the Korean War. So the missile industry was starting to take off, and missiles had a lot of very tiny components in it. So Elgin was going for companies that they thought that they had expertise in. So the strategy of vertical integration and diversification seemed entirely reasonable, totally appropriate, and a logical step in order to diversify the cash flow and the financial basis of the Elgin National Watch Company. Here's a little piece of sexist literature from this time period. And then this is a little booklet that the watch company made to promote its idea of they can make, as they say, bigger profits in small products these days. It's sexist in that they take this rather slender and fashionable lady and they show her trying to zip her up her dress there. Typical male dominated industry and advertising world, I suppose. And if you look down into the small print here, and I'll just bring it up to a little bit bigger in size, their little booklet says this, that this booklet will open your eyes to the new opportunities and profits through Elgin's practical miniaturization. It tells how Elgin can help others, how Elgin can help you. Write today for your miniaturization booklet. So Elgin was not only trying to help other companies, but they're interested in buying companies that were in that line. So their diversification efforts also included, as a byproduct of World War II and then again the Korean War, defense contracting, which they were doing at both their plants in Elgin and Lincoln, and Algiloy, which they were making in Elgin, and the abrasives, which they were making in Elgin, and the Golden Circle rotary cutting tools also being made in Elgin. But they were making electronic components out in LA. That's where they picked up a company out there. And the American Microphone Company, which I referred to a few minutes ago, in Pasadena, and the Advanced Electric and Relay Company in Burbank. So by 1953, the company had, at that point, 6,715 employees at 9 plants. These plants were scattered around the country. That was a big increase in the employees from 1948. 9 plants from Rhode Island to Burbank, LA. That's a lot of territory to be covering from a management standpoint. That's a lot of things to keep your eye on, keep your finger on the pulse, not only of the manufacturing facilities, but the sales end of things. So let's see, move on here a bit. I have to have a sip of water. Elgin was not just resting on its laurels in terms of the watch industry, though. It was coming out with new products and new innovations, one of which was the DuraPower mainspring. And that was made from Algiloy. And the big advantage of the DuraPower mainspring was that it was almost break-proof, and it was very resistant to corrosion. And they touted this as the biggest advance in watchmaking since the invention of jewels some hundreds of years earlier, a few hundred years earlier, like that. Supposed to give the company a big sales boost. It was a big plus for them over their competitors. They also became the first American company to make and market a self-winding watch. Now, self-winding watch being on your wrist, the movement of your wrist would wind it. And they weren't innovation so much on this. The Europeans have been making self-winding watches for a couple of decades, but Elgin was the first American company to make a self-winding watch. They also imported Swiss movements to make self-winding watches. Another of their innovations was the DuraBalance balance wheel. Now, a balance wheel is deep in the movement. It's really what controls the speed of a watch. Make it faster or slower so you can adjust it to have accurate timing. And the balance wheel is a complicated device inside the watch. It's complicated to make, it's complicated to adjust. And the Dura balance wheel was an innovation that made it a little bit easier both to manufacture and also for jewelers to adjust it in the field. So it was another innovation on our part. And the last of their major innovations of this time period didn't quite work out so well. It was the watch of tomorrow, introduced in 1955. That's a watch with a battery in it. And they screwed around trying to get that into the market. Didn't really get it commercially out there till 1962, and then on a limited basis. And basically found out that they had a lot of problems in the field with the watch because the actually battery technology wasn't quite up to it. And the watch was subject to problems with severe shocks to it. One of the things that they touted in describing it was if you were wearing an Elgin electronic watch and you were swinging a golf club, the shock of hitting that ball often would send these watches out of whack. So the watch of tomorrow turned out to be kind of a flop for them. And in this electric watch, I might make a point of this, is that really what they're trying to do is replace the mainspring so that you wouldn't have to wind the watch whenever you change the battery. And the rest of the watch movement was the same. It was different than the electronic watches that would come later with the Bulliva's tuning fork watch and later with the quartz movements. Meanwhile, in the 50s, we have a new face in the non-jeweled watch movements, and that was Timex. And as I said earlier, Timex was created by the U.S. Time Corporation, which was a name change from the Waterbury Clock Company in the middle 40s during the wars. And Timex introduced their watch in U.S. Time introduced their Timex watch in 1950. Now, remember this? The little fuse on the anti-aircraft shells? Well, those fuses did require some pretty precision machining, and they also had to be built to withstand a lot of stress, because when that thing was fired out of the muzzle of the anti-aircraft gun, you could imagine the whack that put onto that little timing device. Well, Elgin wasn't the only one making those fuses. The government was also contracting with U.S. Time to make those fuses. And here are these ladies at the U.S. Time plant in Connecticut. And what are they making? They're making anti-aircraft shells, or anti-aircraft fuses, I should say. Excuse me. And that led to Timex. Now, one of the things that technology that Timex learned, or at least the U.S. Time Corporation learned, was how to make a rugged timing device and to machine it and to have it withstand a lot of shocks. But Timex came out in 50, and the company early advertising was by magazine and newspaper ads, and it really didn't take off until they switched over to television advertising. With television in 1956 was just coming on, and they turned to John Cameron Swayze, one of the first broadcast journalists, a real well-respected journalist, well-known, a guy you could listen to, who was authoritative, you could trust him in that. And he jumped into the TV broadcasting from radio, and he was also a pitchman. And one of the things that U.S. Time did was hire John Cameron Swayze sort of be their host on a variety of commercials. And you could see on the left one of his most famous commercials that Timex came up with, where they strapped a Timex watch onto the propeller of an outboard motor. They dropped it into a tank of water. And they ran that motor at full bore for the duration of the commercial. And then they pulled it out, and John Cameron Swayze with his trench coat on hand in case water splashed out, and also to add to the effect that this was a waterproof, shockproof timepiece. He would say, "It takes a licking and keeps on ticking." Another ad that they use both on in print and in real life is on the right, where they would have little demonstrations. They took a paint can shaker, They created a plexiglass box and to put in place instead of the paint can. And they dropped the Timex watch into that box, and sometimes they even threw in a handful of ice cubes. And they ran that paint can shaker for the duration of the commercial and beat that watch to pieces, and it would come out. It would take a licking and keep on ticking. And notice that two watches they're advertising here are selling for $9.95, $10 essentially, and $12.95, $13 essentially. Elgin watches at that time were selling, up in the $20 range and further up. So Timex wasn't competing directly with Elgin, but as I noted earlier, the unjeweled dollar watch industry, which had evolved to create pretty good stuff through with Timex, it was selling cheaper, and they had restyled these watches, and they were pretty attractive, and they were cutting into the market because that's where the market growth was, in the non-jeweled segment. John Cameron Swayze, who's such a pitch man, here he is selling Camel cigarettes. So wouldn't you want to smoke a cigarette that a trusted newscaster had told you about? I know I almost don't want to. So I've learned better since then. Well, you can't talk about the 1950s without having some reference to these two characters. And in the 1950s, the great question for the watch company was the tariff question. In fact, it was the great question in the 1930s and the 1920s. Because as the Swiss came on, the American watch industry kept asking for more and more tariff protection to protect it from the onslaught of these competitors. So the Eisenhower administration went hot and cold on this. The company made repeated pleas for success. The Eisenhower administration bought into the idea initially that the watch industry was important to the American defense industry, because watches and precision timing devices also had military applications. And they granted some tariff protection to the American watches, but they dropped the tariffs on the 7 and 15 jewel watches, which were the entry-level watches in the Elgin market. And so what was happening is that the Swiss watches were coming in and outperforming in terms of price the American 7 and 15 jewel watches. They were undercutting those markets. And so Elgin gradually moved they couldn't compete for the 7 and 15 jewel market segment. And so they gradually moved out of that. And of course, that took a hit on their sales, but those 7 and 15 jewel watches that Elgin was making were also entry-level items for their whole lineup of watches. So they had that kind of pulled out from underneath them. Well, in 58, the US government, in a report, decided that the watchmaking industry was no longer a military necessity for the country, that warfare had changed, and that protecting the industry from foreign competition really was not all that important. And that was, continuing the gradual loss of tariff protection, which went on for a few more years with that. Okay, so what else is going on at this point in time with the American watch industry? Well, in 51, Elgin begins importing Swiss movements. They won't sell them under the Elgin name originally or initially. They sold them under the Wadsworth name. Wadsworth never made watches up to this point, but they had that name and it had a certain amount of market recognition. So Elgin began importing Swiss movements and selling them as Wadsworth watches. But they also started importing Swiss parts and using them in Elgin watches. So it was becoming, as the 50s unfolded, it was becoming increasingly difficult to tell, what exactly is an Elgin watch and what exactly is a Swiss watch. The company also realizing that times they were not getting a lot of traction in their diversification efforts. They began a cost cutting. The Elgin National Watch Company cutting, was able to keep the company still ticking for another decade or so. They They let go of the Wadsworth plant. The Wadsworth ceased production, publication. The last dividends were paid to the stockholders in 57. Lincoln, Nebraska plant was closed, and some of the other divisions were beginning to falter. So the company was getting to be smaller and smaller. Now, before we get into the big proxy fight, I need to go back and also mention that when Elgin went into the diversification strategy, they also went and borrowed $10 million. It was their first indebtedness since early in the 20th century. And they borrowed that so they'd have the money to go and buy these other companies and enter into these other ventures. So they were throughout the 50s paying down on this $10 million debt. They were paying $500,000 a year for 10 years with the idea that they would pay off the balance, which was $5 million plus interest after 10 years. Well, things didn't exactly work out for them in that way. So in 1958, we have the proxy fight that breaks out. Now, for those of you are wondering, yeah, I know what a proxy fight is, but I'm not exactly sure what a proxy fight is. Well, this is what it is. In a company that sells shares, the shareholders have votes, and the votes are usually used to elect officers into the board of directors, sometimes the president and chief operating officer, but those positions are often appointed from the board members. And in a proxy fight, one side goes around to the shareholders and tries to acquire the proxy to vote their shares for them. So in 1958, a dissident faction of shareholders begins to buy up shares to change the management structure of the Elgin National Watch Company. So if I could use a little Howard Cosell takeoff here, in one corner, we have the challenger, Henry Margolis, the challenger from New York City. And in the other corner, we have the champion, James Shannon from Elgin, Illinois. Well, actually lived in Wayne, but he was the president of the company. So this fight for the control of the company begins when Margolis starts buying up shares. And it catches Elgin management by surprise when he files with the Security and Exchange Commission that he's going to enter into a proxy war to have his guys put on the board. It catches the company by surprise, and Shannon and others, they rally against it to say Margolis has no background in this industry. We've had some tough times. 1957, 58 were tough years for the watch industry because of a recession. They also had some tough times with the defense contract. And so those weren't the best years for them. They lost money in that years, 58, but the proxy fight was on. And ultimately, it knocked out James Shannon. So Margolis comes on, and his pitch to the shareholders was that Elgin was a sick business operation. But who is this guy, Henry Margolis? Where did he come from? What was his motivation? That we can only kind of discern indirectly. The people that know the answers to that are no longer alive. So Margolis was a New York businessman. He grew up in New York, went to New York City College. He was an attorney. He got his hand into as an owner or partial owner of several small manufacturing businesses. He was in the restaurant business as an owner, not as a cook, not as a guy working there, but as a guy financing them. He had hotels, a hotel or more than one hotel at one time. He was a Broadway producer. He had a partnership in an English movie studio. But most importantly for this discussion, he was the chairman of the Aero Supply Corporation. And what was that? Well, Aero Supply was a company that was trying to get into the very same business that Elgin was, and that was making parts for missiles. Now, Margolis was buying up shares, but as chairman of the Aero Supply Company, he also had the Aero Supply Company buying up shares of Elgin stock. So the years of 58 through 60 are what I call the transition years. As I said, Elgin had a bad year in 58. They lost money. It was the first unprofitable year since 33. And that is why Margolis was saying Elgin was a sick business company. So Margolis tries in 58, he gains a seat on Elgin's 11-member board. Two other people that he tried to put on the board were not elected. And by 1960, he and Shannon had it with each other, and Shannon resigns. Margolis became the chairman and temporary president, and gradually other Margolis allies joined the board. And between 1957 and 1960, 9 of Elgin's board members leave. There's an 11-person board, 9 of them are gone, and all of them are replaced by New York businessmen and investors. So Margolis brings a whole different culture to the Elgin board. Some of those people that were displaced had been on the board for years, and some of those board members had passed those board chairs, those board seats, I should say, down through multiple generations, 1 and 2 and 3 generations of family members that were serving on the board. So Margolis begins to take the company in a lot of different directions at once, and it's upsetting the culture of the boardroom, and it's upsetting a lot of people as he starts a cost-cutting campaign. A lot of people working in the factories around town, especially here in Elgin. So as I said, Elgin's importing parts, and by 65, half the parts that Elgin's using are being made in Switzerland. Now, there's a few plants that Elgin had that most lectures on this subject don't touch on, and most people aren't even aware that Elgin had them. But Elgin, in the late 50s, acquired a Swiss watchmaking plant, and they in Switzerland, in Neuchâtel, and the ever cautious Swiss government, which had done a lot to promote the Swiss watch industry through things like favorable regulations, allowing companies to collaborate, making sure that companies were not competing against each other in terms of market niches, sponsoring schools of horology that teach watchmaking, sponsoring competitions within Switzerland to improve and push forth the watchmaking skills of the various companies. Well, ever protective of the Swiss watch industries, the Swiss government said, yes, you could buy a factory in Switzerland, but you could only have 30 employees. And they held them to that for a few years. But that was Elgin's way to at least have a little parts coming in from Switzerland. Another plant that Elgin got into at this time was in the Virgin Islands. They incorporated a wholly owned subsidiary called Master Time in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And of course, the idea here was not only to take advantage of the lower labor cost in the Caribbean, but also to beat the tariffs because that was a U.S. territory. And so if you could import parts to the Virgin Islands or make them there and assemble watches or sub-assemblies of watches and send them to the United States, you could get around some of the tariff restrictions of using watches and watch parts from overseas. So Master Time was incorporated in the Virgin Islands, and I believe Hamilton Watch Company also had a plant in the Virgin Islands. And the watch company struggled to get this plant off the ground. It was making parts, and it began a little bit of assembly. It seems to have never really reached its full potential in terms of quality production or even quantity production, but it was one of their efforts. And of course, we all know about the Elgin, South Carolina plant, which was Blaney, South Carolina. They changed the name to attract the plant. Elgin opened the plant in '63. It's basically an assembly plant, and they were making parts there as well. And of course, the attempt there was to stay within the United States, but take advantage of the lower wages in South Carolina. Now we enter what I call the unrecognizable years for the Elgin National Watch Company. Unrecognizable because it's doubtful. Well, it's one never knows, but it's not the way you would assume that the old Shannon Company would have gone in terms of some of their efforts. In 1961, Margolis takes them into buying Bradley Time, which is a East Coast-based operation. And Bradley made non-jeweled dollar watches, essentially what they call character watches with pictures like Mickey Mouse and baseball stars and cartoon figures on them. They're watches for the kid market. If you're at Elgin and you're making fine jeweled movements, the idea that you're got a company that's making, first of all, watches that are undercutting you, and second, that are, well, let's say cheap junk, that it's hard to imagine what's going on here. In 61, they acquire a Chicago company, Welby Clock, and Welby's importing a lot of clocks, wall clocks like this mid-century modern masterpiece sort. Wouldn't you like to have that on your wall today? No thanks myself. I saw a lot of that when I was a kid. Don't want to go back and relive it. And also mantle clocks and some grandfather clocks. They were importing those from Europe and making some of that stuff, not the mantle clocks so much in the United States. And in 63, they acquired the Hasbro Company. Hasbro was mostly an assembly plant, another Swiss firm in origin, but also with great ties to the American industry. I take it back on the Swiss. The Hasbros were Russian immigrants that were making watches in New Jersey, if I recall, mostly using foreign-made parts. They were cheap watches. So Margolis also begins to take the company back into the defense contracting. After 58, Elgin kind of got out of defense contracting. They had a hard time delivering out of defense contracting that year because of their loss there. But Margolis took them back into defense contracting. And he did this in a way that was very interesting to me and which I'd like to know a lot more about. But what happened was Margolis struck up a relationship with the senator from Alabama who was on the Armed Forces, what's it called? The Senate Armed Forces Committee. And what he did is he finagled with this guy that Elgin would get a no-bid contract to open a plant in Gadsden, Alabama, which just by some coincidence had a vacant plant there, and by a further coincidence was the town that the senator was from. And they would be making missile parts there and fuses and related defense projects. They also leased a plant in St. Charles, an already built plant in St. Charles for the same purpose. This was Margolis's attempt to really cash in on the defense industry, but it turned out to be a debacle. Elgin could not produce the products that the military wanted. There was a lot of haggling about this, that the specifications were unclear, that the quality of the material was not what the government wanted. It went back and forth and back and forth. Finally went into a kind of an arbitration with Uncle Sam, and Elgin accepted a $1.5 million loss on the deal and backed out of the defense contracting business. In 63, they acquired a diamond ring company. Now we're in the watch business, so what are we doing buying diamond ring companies? And a few years later, they bought 2 more diamond ring companies. Well, again, a Margolis connection, most likely because the diamond ring industry was centered in New York. I'm sure Margolis was aware of some of these people that were running those companies, and whether they were profitable or not, I couldn't say. But what this is all leading to was that the Elgin brand name was strong, and even though the company was getting a little rickety in terms of its profitabilities, they could use that brand name to label products like transistor radios and other things and try to sell them under the Elgin name. So they're drifting away from the watch industry, even though they have made it. So we see in the unrecognizable years what was reported to be the last all-American parts made Elgin movement being done. and a couple of their divisions being closed and sold off. Finally, 1964, the big plant on National Street being closed down as out of date, inefficient, um, not able to be justified based on the amount of production that was coming out of it. So the big shop on National Street was put up for sale. And, of course, a great psychological blow to the city and its residents who were strongly identified with this magnificent structure. And people ask, well, why didn't they save that plant? Well, the simple answer is nobody wanted it. They couldn't sell it. Nobody wanted it. The land it was standing on was worth more than the building, and the building was an impediment to getting at the land. So that's why they didn't save it. Nobody wanted it. So, of course, everybody knows as they gobbled up the plant, they began to chop it down, and finally resulting in the final blast in 1966. Here's a look at Elgin's profit and loss between 55 and 67. You can see that the bad years were bad and the good years weren't all that good. So in 64, a proxy fight breaks out again. In 64, sales reached 64 million for all the divisions and all the companies that Elgin had under its wing. But the profits are less than 600,000. That's less than 1%. The $64 million company with a 1% profit margin, that is not good. And keep in mind, the company hasn't paid a dividend since the 1957 or 58. So this is not making that stock very attractive on the open stock market. And one of Margolis's guys brought onto the board, A. Philip Goldsmith, challenges Margolis for control of the company. This is a little boardroom drama that we'd like to know more about or have been a fly on the wall. Margolis brought Goldsmith in. Goldsmith said with the idea that Margolis, who was temporarily serving as president, would step aside and Goldsmith would take it over. Now, Goldsmith came out of the textile industry. So what did he know about watchmaking? I have to wonder. But Margolis reneged on that promise, according to Goldsmith, and Goldsmith challenged Margolis in a proxy fight for control of the company. Goldsmith lost. Also in this time period, the corporate offices are moved to New York and back to Elgin. There's all kinds of other things going on with different plants in different places being moved here, there, everywhere. It's just total chaos. So in 64 and 65, the company's debt that they took out on that 10 million back to start the diversification program has now come due. They're 15 million in debt, and they have no money to pay it, and they default on their loans. And this requires restructuring of the debt, and the debtors or the creditors provide enforce new conditions on the company. No sale of assets without pre-approval, no dividends to be paid, no buying back of stock, and so on and so forth. In other words, the creditors are really running the company from behind the scenes. And the creditors consist of a couple of banks, an insurance company, and the Zale jewelry company. They're all propping up the company's finances. This is 64 and 65. So the once great watch company is essentially doomed. Margolis sees what's going on or whatever. He's getting pressure from whatever. So he sells his shares, 17% of the company's shares, to the Swiss. Why did he do that? What he had going, who knows? In 1967, tariffs on imported watches are reduced 30%. The company is as good as doomed in the watch industry. It could be nothing more than an importer and seller. It can no longer make it as a manufacturer. So we're close to the end of the story. The company's financially out of money, out of time, and we come in to meet another company similarly on the rocks called Thompson Starrett. They're in bankruptcy. Thompson Starrett's a manufacturing company. They're a engineering and construction management company, and they build big things. This is a 1923 picture of the buildings they built in New York City. They build big things. They build dams. They build big buildings. They build military bases, things like that. And they're in bankruptcy. Locally, one of the things they built was the Sears complex over on Holman Avenue in Chicago. So in 67, Thompson Surratt is dismantled as a bankrupt company, and it's merged with a couple other firms by the brokerage firm, New York brokerage firm of Weiss, Voisin, and Cannon. And the brokerage firm takes the remnants of the Thompson Surratt and these other couple of companies. They combine them into a thing called TST Industries. As soon as they get that organized, TST suddenly comes in the following year, actually a few months later, and they purchase 36% of Elgin stock and 75% of its debt. So TST is now really running the company. And TST is really run by the brokerage firm of Weiss, Voisin, and Cannon. So they combine what's left of the two companies that they're in control of TST and Elgin Watch, into a new company called Elgin National Industries. And essentially the trading of Elgin National Industries stock begins in 69. And that's really the end, for all practical purposes, of anything that was left of Elgin National Watch Company. The new Elgin National Industries has 11 board members that come from the TST side of the merger, including Mr. Cannon, who's the president also of the brokerage firm that set all this up and is becomes chairman of the Elgin National Industries board. Okay, so a little quick postscript here. And that's the pension fight. And as I said earlier, we're indebted to the family of Walter Volman for some of the information that shed light upon this. Very briefly, a few years after the Elgin National Industries is in business and taking over, and Elgin as a watch company has just become an importer and a brand name, nothing of any substance behind it beyond that in terms of manufacturing at any rate. Elgin National Industries in 1973, they're based in New York City. They filed with the New York Supreme Court that they want to terminate the old pension fund that they inherited from the watch company. They're going to terminate it. They're going to buy an annuity from an insurance company that will pay off the pensioners over a number of years. And they will take that pension fund, which was valued about $30 million, with a surplus of $12 million over what the pensioners would have gotten. They're going to take that, get that annuity going, and they're going to hang on to the remainder, which was about $12 million. Well, they filed in New York Supreme Court to do this in January. About a week later, they show up in Elgin and tell the pensioners that, hey, this is what we're going to do. And of course, it creates a furor with them. At that time, there's almost 1,100 retirees on pensions, but down through the years, the payment on the pensions have not kept up with inflation, and a lot of those pension checks are not going very far. The pensioners, they claim, hey, we want to retain the entire fund, get a boost to our pension, and we're going to sue to get it. So 1973 is a long series of legal battles, both in New York and locally, to slow down Elgin National Industries' plan to go for it. And amongst the celebrities that appeared on here at the time was Senator Adlai Stevenson. And here he is meeting with the pensioners in Elgin in February of '73 to hear about their woes and see what he could do about it. Walter Volman was the chairman of the pension committee, and along with several other people that are listed in the book here. And what happens is they duke it out with the Elgin National Industries throughout the summer, and finally Elgin National Industries comes back in August and makes a settlement proposal to the pensioners. And in that proposal, they say, yes, we're going to go forth with this idea of the annuity, but we're going to give you a one-time payment based on your years of service, and we're going to up the amount that we had originally said would be in the pension payments that you would be getting. And that's what we're going to do. Now, did the pension committee know a little fact that was about to emerge a few weeks after they had their meeting in August? And that fact was that when the case landed in the New York Supreme Court, the court appointed what they called a referee to evaluate all the evidence on it. And basically, what the referee came back and said was that the pensioners really had no case. They may have been morally justified in what they were asking for, but that very early on, the company had said when they set up the pension fund, and that if the fund, they had the prerogative to dissolve the fund and buy annuities to meet whatever unmet obligation were still there. And they reinforced that in 43 by not only stating it, but giving all the pensioners every year that they entered into the system and every year that they got a book, a little booklet that said this. And so Elgin National Industries relied on this, and the referee said, yes, basically the pensioners really could not legally prevail in this particular case because they should have known this was happening. They were told it was happening. Companies within its rights that let this happen. And sadly, when that pension fund of 30 million was dissolved, that extra 12 million or so, we don't exactly know what the number was. That money was just taken by Elgin National Industries in cash out of it. There was a good side to all of this, and that's that in 1974, the Employment Retirement Income Security Act was passed by Congress. This act, which was designed to prevent exactly this kind of looting of pension funds, had been kicking around in Congress for 10 years or more. And the case in Elgin was enough to give it the impetus to finally get it through Congress. So that is the story. I just want to make a brief afterword about it. Life goes on, things change, things sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad, but I think we are at least blessed that we have these wonderful pieces of jewelry and these great little mechanical devices of all of these watches, and there are millions of them out there, thousands available any given day on sale on the line, and you could enjoy the craftsmanship and the quality that went into making these watches, and you could enjoy understanding the great workforce that was behind all of that stuff. So we want to, I think there's one more slide. Nope. Yep. That's it. Back to the shameless commerce if you want to. Yeah, I don't know what that's about, but anyway, back to here. And here's once again, the book Elgin Time is available at the museum store or on the web. And what do I need to do here, Liz? Go back to stop share and oh, right here. There we go. Thank you. Oh, it's Trish.
I'm back.
She's back.
That was great. Does anyone have any questions for Bill? You can type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Well, somewhere in chat.
I had a general question, Bill, about the museum hours right now. Is the museum open?
Yes, it is open. Opened a couple of days ago.
Oh, good. Good to hear. I really enjoyed your presentation today.
The hours I'm told by Liz are 11 to 4 on Wednesday through Saturday. And other times for research purposes are available by appointment. And if you wanted to pick up something from the store, you call ahead and we could probably arrange to do that too.
Okay, great. Great to hear. Thanks.
Hello. I have a question. This is Dan Wright. I have an Elgin, an interesting Elgin piece that I need to get some research done on. And I was wondering if I were a member of the museum or of your museum, do you have some type of research access to documentation or anything like that?
Well, what's the piece?
Well, it's a military piece. I actually have a canister, and I could go run and get it right now. It's a canister about this big, that big around. It's a United States Air Force. It looks like it's a timing device. You open the canister, it hasn't been used. It's like, it's new old stock. You open the top of it up and there's a long tube in it. Inside of it is actually an Elgin pocket watch that's inside of this. You turn, in order to wind the watch, you turn this lever on the outside of it. It looks like it was placed inside of another device, whether it was a timing device for an aircraft of some kind, or whether it was I don't
Right.
know.
So is that watch suspended by springs in there?
I haven't looked in there. It might be. It was actually dated 1951. Is the canisters dated 1951?
Okay, so they did make for navigation purposes on aircraft, which had a lot of vibrations. They did make a watch that was suspended in a canister that was suspended on springs to absorb the vibration of the plane.
So the interesting part about this is there's no dial on it. So it's the internal work. It actually it's a movement, an Elgin movement, in a strange case that's doesn't have a backer cover on it. And whatever when you plug it into whatever, it almost like it runs another device, but the movement is inside of this canister.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't ring any bells. There are people that are interested in military timepieces, and that would be a place to go look them up and see, because these are guys that have great expertise in those kind of things.
Okay.
So that would be a starting place for it. Okay. Anybody else?
Bill, I have a couple questions from the chat. I have a question from Ruth, and she said, "Are you familiar with the name Jerome Robbins? I recall he was
yes.
president of the company from around 1965 until 69, but his name was not mentioned today."
No, I had to truncate a lot of the drama and the different personalities involved. Jerome Robbins was the president from 65 to 68. He was a guy who came out of the sales division of Bulova. And also he had worked for Omega Watch. So at the end of the company's life, Robbins was pretty close to the industry and knew what was going on in that. So yes, like I say, in the interest of time and that, we just had to drop out introducing too many names and personalities. But Jerome Robbins is well known to me, and I think to people in the watch industry at that time.
Okay, I have another one from Dwight. Do you have any idea what Frederick Francis invented for the watch company?
Say that again.
Do you have any idea what Frederick Francis invented for the watch company?
No, I don't.
I feel like we're playing Jeopardy a little bit.
Yeah, I know. I'm not good at that.
Okay. Another one is, does information on employees exist somewhere?
Yes and no. Somebody I saw that had wanted a list of all the employees, which of course doesn't exist anymore. But the Watchword magazine, which was published from like about 1921 up to about the middle 1950s, we have an index on that, and it has a name index, and you could find almost everybody sooner or later got mentioned in the Watchword who was an employee, except for the employees that were very short term in that. That's one place to look for it. There's a couple other records, but no, we don't have a comprehensive, easily searchable list on that.
Okay, here's another one from Michael. Do you think Henry Margolis's plan was to raid the pension fund from day one? He sold off the divisions that were making profits and seemed to try and make a mess with the other companies they purchased at the time.
Boy, a lot of people are ask that or feel that was the case, or just let Margolis be the bad guy in the big story. I have no ability to have a reasonable opinion about it one way. Reasonably well-informed opinion about what his motivation was. I don't think he would have bought into the company just to get the pension fund when he first came into it. And I think it's probably because the pension fund survived until 73, long after Margolis was gone, and after the company was merged into Elgin National Industries by 4 or 5 years, whatever it was there. I would say it's unlikely that the pension fund was Margolis's target. But that's just a guess.
So there's
Yeah.
another question from Ginger regarding the radium and the ladies who painted the dials. Now, I know that there is a book. Liz, do you remember who the author of the book is? Or does someone?
Yeah, well, the book on radium dials.
Yeah.
Yeah, Radium Girls or something like that.
Mhm.
Okay, so Elgin was very, very clean with its use of radium. The radium dial, what were tragedy, I guess, would be, was with other companies. And West Clocks down in LaSalle, Illinois, is this. I think that is the subject of that book. And there's other companies around the country, and West Clocks was, first of all, clocks are bigger than watches, so you're using more radium. And second, they are apparently were very sloppy in their control of it. Elgin prided itself in how careful it was with the radium. They claim to have never had a claim, and even after the plant was tore down, the amount of contamination in the soil around where the dial room was very limited. I mean, they were able to just quickly dig that up and get rid of it. But when the company was in business, they had exhaust fans. The people wore clean smocks every day. The surfaces that they worked on were wiped down. The amount of radium that was dispensed to the employees was only barely what they needed. It was very tightly controlled, and they did a very good job of preventing radium contamination.
There's the
Radium
book.
Girls, right? That's the title of it. It's been a while since I've seen it. There's even a play that's came out after that.
Yeah,
Sure.
it's by the author is Kate Moore, so that has a lot more information.
Yeah, on
about,
that. Yeah, not to be
radium.
confused with Elgin.
So I had another question from Ira and Jackie. As a docent, people ask me who makes 1970s onward Elgin watches. Is that any particular company or just?
So the early mechanical watches that were labeled Elgin and imported to the country company into, the country, were Swiss made. And then nowadays,
Hello.
the watches that are labeled Elgin, the few ones that are out are just movements. They're quartz movements that come out of these factories in Asia, and factories crank out watches for all kinds of companies to label. So,
Sorry, Ginger, did you have a question? I muted her on accident. So another question is it safe to say that any Elgin quartz watch is likely post Great Watch Company?
oh yes, absolutely.
Okay. And then Marge asked if the pensioners continued to receive dollars or were the pensions just ended?
Well, what happened is they did continue to receive dollars because what the company did was go to an insurance company and buy an annuity. And I don't know the exact dollar amounts involved here, but for instance, it works like this. The company goes to the insurance company, they give them $10 million. The insurance company's already figured out, they say, okay, $10 million will cover, given the life expectancy of the people that are still alive and receiving a pension, the amount of the pension they got, and any cost of living increases. $10 million will take you so far in time. And what we'll do is the insurance company will try to make a little profit on that $10 million while it's invested, and they continue to pay out on that annuity. But once the people pass away, then the annuity, like the pension fund, disappears.
Let's see. I think that is all the questions from the chat. Does anyone else have any questions? Thank you for all the compliments, everyone.
Okay, so I have a question. Hey, what's the next program the museum has coming up?
Oh, let me tell you about that. The next program is in partnership with the library. And it is Linda Rock is going to talk about the It's called How Sweet It Is. And she's going to talk about manufacturing of sweets and treats here in Elgin. And she's researched factories and home making of treats. I don't know if Linda is still on the call, but you can go to the library's website to register for that, or go to our website and go to our calendar.
Okay, very
I'm
good.
here.
Was that a good description, Linda?
That was a very good description. Unfortunately, if we could meet together, we'd also share candy, but we can't do that. So you have to bring your own to the,
But that is that'll be a virtual event as well as like this one, so you guys can all sign up for that.
Oh, I have another question. You ready?
Ready?
Okay. How can people who enjoy these types of programs help support the museum?
Well, that's an excellent question, but the museum, we love donations a lot, and you can go to our homepage at elginhistory.org, and right there's a button that says Donate Now. So you can always use that, but there are many other ways you can help support us, and that's by telling your friends about our programs, signing up for our email list, buying something from our shop. Anything like that helps you support the museum, and we appreciate anything that you can do for us.
All right, that sounds
I
like a
have-
pretty good deal.
I have one comment just as an out-of-state attendee. I attended this and I did the one on trains, is that after COVID is over and you guys get to meet together because you're all close by, that you continue some kind of online programming, because I live 1,000 miles away and I haven't lived in Elgin for 40 years, but my parents were there, my grandparents were there. I joined the museum at my 50th high school class reunion, and I would hope you would find a way to continue this kind of programming. And I will find other questions for you, Bill, because I had questions about the State Mental Hospital, which I remember singing carols at, but is not what I remember as a child, of course, anymore. So I'll contact you separately.
Okay, glad to answer anything with the hospital too. And you make a good point, and I think what the COVID has taught us is first of all, it's compelled us to go to these digital or these virtual sessions, and it's also given us the ability to develop the skills to do those live as we've done today. And we also have several little video clips of different subjects that are on our YouTube channel. So we've been producing content that way as well for people that are out of the local area. So good ways to engage with us.
That was one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, is that this has been recorded, and we will, for anyone who came in late or couldn't catch the whole presentation, we will put it on our YouTube channel, and I'll send out an email notification and post it on Facebook as well. So if you think anyone would be interested, you can send them the link once it's on YouTube.
All right, anything else? Nope.
Luann, if you go to YouTube and just do a search for the Elgin History Museum, you should be able to find our channel.
Yes, but also be aware that there's an Elgin History Museum in Canada as well. So sometimes people end up on their website and also their pages. I think they have something going on YouTube as well. So watch out for that, Elgin History Museum.
Trish and Bill, just quickly, you may have mentioned it at the beginning and I failed to capture it. Is there a way to contact Bill directly through email or what have you?
Oh, sure. Should I give you my email address? I hope
I'm
these
happy to
fine
receive it.
people won't turn into, it won't turn into an onslaught. Well, Liz tells me the best way to do that is just to contact the museum.
Museum at Elgin.
And that is the email address is museum@elginhistory.org, not .com.org. One word, museum, and then at Elgin, the @ sign, elginhistory.org. So
Thank you.
that's a good way to do it, I guess. Trish, anything else we got going?
No, I think we answered everyone's questions.
Well, my trusty Elgin watch tells me it's about time to get a drink of water and get up and move around a little bit. So that goes for all of us.
Start waving.
Thanks again, everyone. It was really nice to see all of you. See you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.